Hello, good evening, welcome, namaskar. I'm Sudeep Sen. I'm speaking from New Delhi, and my co-curator and co-host Indran. Hello, Indran.
Hello, good morning, Sudeep. Good morning, everyone. I'm speaking from Rockville, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. Welcome all.
Yeah, so he's just about finished his cup of tea, and I should be having a glass of wine, but I can't quite yet. So welcome. This is a revival of a series which Indran and I started when we were just out of college after Columbia University. We were at the School of Journalism. And last month, we gathered some of the alumni together and had this sort of launch party online. And it was amazing that we could track about 12 or 13 people who are now all very, very established authors. At the time, we were not even one book old or maybe one book old. And it was just wonderful to see many people after 30, 40 years. It was just wonderful. So we begin with George Szirtes. Everybody has about 12 minutes to read. And then at the end, we will respond to each other's work, have a chat. If people have questions, we'll take that on. But we, as the audience, the live audience, please feel free to ask questions. And if time permits, we will end with one short poem by everyone at the end, just as a signature round off. Indran, welcome. Do you want to say something?
Just to say thank you for being here. We're really excited to kick off this new year with some hope and joy in the possibility that we will meet again in the flesh fairly soon. But meanwhile, we will meet here and listen to really excellent poetry and fiction, though I tend to favor the poetry side, I must admit, but it is poets and writers after all, so I need to mention.
Actually really strange because in fact when we were curating, we end up picking poets first. I mean, we forget that there are fiction writers in the world.
These ancient biases, but anyway, let's not let's think positively. Bring everyone together. Welcome.
Indeed.
Go ahead, Sudeep. Why don't you take it from here?
So I'll formally introduce George. George and I know each other for, I don't know, many, many decades. And it's really an honor and it's wonderful that George Szirtes is actually launching this series for us. It's a huge, we have fabulous authors lined up for the rest of the year. We have 4 people at a time. So, and now there's a queue of people who want to be on air. It's just quite something. So George, it's a real treat to have you here. Let me just read out the shorter version of the bio, which is also in the chat box. George Szirtes is a Hungarian-born author of some 15 books of poetry in English and 15 books of translation from the Hungarian, including the fabulous anthology, The Colonnade of Teeth, 20th Century Hungarian Poetry, which was published in 1996. Should have a copy here, which I'd like to show you. It's a very, very important book. I think anybody who wants to sort of have access to Hungarian poetry, at least up to a certain point in time, that's a good place to start. And the other parallel anthology which she did is called New Voices, which is also, this is published by ARC in the UK. And the other one is An Island Sound, Hungarian Poetry and Fiction Before and Beyond the Iron Curtain in 2004. He has won practically every award in the world, including the T.S. Eliot Prize for Real, and he won the International Booker for his translation of Laszlo. How do you pronounce this? Laszlo?
Krasznahorkai. Laszlo Krasznahorkai.
He won the International Booker Prize. He co-shared it with him. His new book, which I actually haven't read because it's just come out and it takes a while to think for books to reach India, is a memoir of his mother, which has been doing really, really well. And it just won the James Tate Black Prize. It's titled The Photographer at 16. And of course, his books have been published in Italian, German, Chinese, and so many other languages. And he's been honored and elected as a fellow of Royal Society for Literature in England. George, there are so many sides to you. You're a children's writer, you're a painter, you're an artist. Initially he trained as an artist, and his wife, Clarissa Upchurch is a fabulous artist. And they're quite a fabulous pair. They're such great ambassador for the UK and for Europe. And I have to say, both Jenny and George, and we'll come to Mervyn and Sara later because you sort of on the other side of the Atlantic. Very rarely do I find UK authors truly multicultural. And I feel both George and Jenny sort of fall in that space. So George, it's all yours. Welcome.
Well, thank you very, very much, Sudeep. That's a very kind introduction, a very warm one. And it is lovely to see you on the screen as well as the others. Right, I'm reading for about 12 minutes. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read 2 poems which are just over a page, and I'll show you a few little ones in between. The first one I'm reading is called Mist. It's from a poem called Meeting Austerlitz, which is a poem in memoriam of W.G. Sebald, who was a wonderful writer, who died in 2001 as the result of a car accident. I knew him, we were colleagues. So this is written for him. And the poem begins with the premise that as I'm going out on a winter evening after knowing about his death, I meet him in the fields in the guise of the character of his last book, Austerlitz. So that is chiefly all you really need to know. And a conversation ensues between myself and Austerlitz. At the very end of the poem, there's a reference to buildings twisted into macabre shapes. Now, he died on the 14th of December 2001, and this is a kind of memory of 9/11. So that's the landscape, but it's a field. Meeting Austerlitz. The cold sat down with frozen fingers. Cars were iced up. The pavements were treacherous. Boys in T-shirts drifted through doors of bars in quiet market towns. The shops were a chorus of seasonal favorites. Everyone the same. We were jollying ourselves up for Christmas without much money and no sense of shame because this was a time for giving and for joy. We were all good intentions. So the postman came and went, lorries delivered supplies, the boy with the papers zipped about on his bike, parents were packing the latest must-have toy, each one expensive, everyone alike. The butcher's whole family were busy serving, and no one had fallen ill or gone on strike. On ungritted roads, motorists were swerving to avoid each other. Nothing had come to bits in the houses of the whole and the wholly deserving. Nothing was incomprehensible or beyond our wits, and I myself was taking a quiet stroll in the nearby fields when I met Austerlitz. It was some way off the road, and he was the sole patch of dark in a bright mid-afternoon. "Hello, Max," I said, and he looked up with a droll, melancholy expression. There was the faintest moon visible in the sky. "Both day and night," he grinned. "It'll be dusk pretty soon." In Lalarook, if I remember right, I've not read Thomas More for several years. There's a veiled prophet, Hakim, who radiates light and draws the moon from a well. When it appears, it eclipses the real moon. Perhaps we have invented the sad pale thing there with its terrible shears. The air was frosty, oddly tobacco scented. Thick grey clouds rose from his mouth as he spoke. I could not be certain whether the wisps that entered my mouth were frozen breath or cigarette smoke. Everything had a double or existed in some version of itself, wrapped in a winter cloak. It was as if an enormous window had missed it. Austerlitz was looking across the field. Beyond the window, There were buildings twisted into macabre shapes. Some creature squealed in the distance. The car growled briefly past, then silence, complete, and vacuum sealed. That is the first of 7 parts of this poem. I will read next a short prose poem called Vanitas. You will probably remember or know that Vanitas paintings were those that showed briefly lived things, flowers, petals, animals, bubbles, and so forth. So this is somebody speaking about a vanitas. My time is limited. I'm not to be reached by telephone or Ouija board. My mind is bubbles and oranges. My death will go unnoticed. Your black tulips are already in my diary and will be attended to in due course. These days are precious, jewels in a perfect watch. You think I'm prepared for this? No one is. My vanity contains my mortal remains. Look, it is night. No one returns from places such as this. My books say nothing. My peacock eye is a fabrication. And you haven't even seen inside my trunk yet. Let me flash my calf for you. Open that book now. There's nothing in it but night, which has no text. Get reading. Start right here. Now we'll read a series of very short poems based essentially upon the coronavirus that we've all been suffering. But this first one features a character called Uncle Zoltan, who doesn't exist, but he's at least 400 years old. He's a notorious liar and fantasist. And he speaks in many, he used to speak in tweets, but he speaks in a short volume all of his own. This is Uncle Zoltan's Plague Times. My Uncle Zoltan had an eye for disasters. He'd watch them passing like a smear of crows cursing at the failing light. His Gothic nature sympathized with them, drunk on a melodrama. He was facetious. Sometimes he was right. Stage fright. Everybody dies, or possibly not, because the script is unclear. The gods excel at ambiguity. Their will is rarely questioned. Whether we remain or vanish with the night is a matter of bluff and counter-bluff. No? And this is a very short poem in memory of somebody who both Sudeep and I knew, I only a little, Mangalash Dabral. These are all 10-line poems. Mangalash died this year, just a week or so ago, from the COVID. The death of poets is no worse than of others. All the same, I grieve for those who, like me, labor at the very same minor precisions, or find themselves borne on this or that gust of wind that blows through their words and sends them flying. The list of bad things. The list of bad things is not hierarchical, so I shall desist from naming them all in proper order of sadness and daily horror. We are watching clouds stall, sail, and mount while yearning for the rain that falls where and when it likes. And ridiculous. Every so often, a ludicrous idea occurs to the world. A moment of fear balloons. The bolt of lightning strikes the garden chair. How ridiculous and crazy the light on glass, the cat's lazy yawn. And so life changes. I will finish with a poem called Madhouse, which is from The Burning of the Book, the 2009 book. It's from a series of 14, and it is essentially based around Auto de Fe by Elias Canetti. The characters in it who you meet right at the end include a dwarf, a scholar, and a fire. And it bookends with the burning of the scholar's library. Well, the poem's a bit crazy, but I'll leave it there. Here we go, Madhouse. The point about the madhouse is that it's virile. The point about the madhouse is that it sticks by its beliefs. The point about the madhouse is that sanity is bourgeois. The point about the madhouse is that no one is acting. The point about the madhouse is that no one gets in by simply being nice. The point about the madhouse is that it liberates the spirit. The point about the madhouse is that you can think just what you like there. The point about the madhouse is that anyone can enter. There's nothing special about the madhouse. People come and go all the time. There's nothing threatening about the madhouse. Are all of us dying? There's nothing terminal about the madhouse. You go along for the ride. There's nothing sad about the madhouse. Weeping and gnashing of teeth, that's nothing. There's nothing mad about the madhouse. It is sanity by default. We are sane by default. We are mad by design, but the mad are more admirable. Admirable is the ape, the bulbul, the mitochondrion, the swelling of the larynx. Admirable the orchid, the garlic, the fire inside the shut book. Admirable the cry of the tortured, the lost voice of the nightingale, the laughter in everything ostensibly sane, but tending towards madness, such as sunlight, the slow rain, each pendulous drop, the wide road, the brimming eye, shadows, picnics, public conveyances, thunder. Nature is a madness with a method, and all the madder for that. Culture is a madness everyone inherits. Science is a madness in love with numbers, the perfect amour fou. Health is a madness that shifts from minute to minute, Gesundheit. Money is madness that fills your pockets and leaves a silver slug trail in the garden. The point about the madhouse is not to describe it. The point about the madhouse is not to change it. The point about the madhouse is to live there, to accustom yourself to its immaculate manners, to dwell in the house of the Lord forever with the prophet, the poet, the dwarf, the scholar, the fire. Thank you.
Brilliant. What a brilliant poem to end, George. I really wished you also read some of your children's poetry, because that's such an important part of you. Perhaps you could read one short one. Do you have one accessible?
I do have a short one. Okay. I read your short one, which is also
this is one of the books I really like. I've gifted it to so many of my friends. Kids.
Oh, that's one of my first ones. What I've picked up here is this one, which came out.
Can you just put it closer to
The Land of the Giants, in the Land of the Giants. And this is actually a very short translation from the Hungarian of a great Hungarian 20th century poet, Sándor Vörös. And he wrote it for children, and this is a book for children, which has a number of Hungarian children's poems in it. This is called A Bear's Dilemma. Winter's going, here comes spring. Grizzly bear sits pondering, back to sleep, or time to wake. What an awful choice to make. To leave the cave, explore the wood. There might be berries, could be good. And is the honey nice and sticky? That is a question. Oh, how tricky.
Well,
You didn't fall for the trick here. Trick. Thank you so much, George. We could either have a chat now or we could wait, but it depends on how big. I want to keep it as fluid as possible because everybody's participating in this sort of organically rather than just sort of taking it from cut to cut. But maybe if we wait for all the 4 points, then we might have too much in our head to, in terms of recall value. But tell me, George, one thing. You started off as a painter, of course, and you still draw, but you don't publicly show your artwork, I know, but it's there in many of your books. It's in this one. I have this beautiful letterpress edition of this.
That's a gorgeous book, but I didn't do the drawings.
You didn't do the drawings, I know that. But often you have illustrations, and your wife, when you ran a press, a letterpress, and tell us more about it, because it's like poetry, running a letterpress with drawings and collaborating with people.
Yeah.
Tell us more about it and how art and poetry sort of interact in your own work.
Well, I was trained insofar as I was trained as a painter at an art school. That's my background. I didn't go to university. I went to art school, which is actually where I met my wife, Clarissa. And then after art school, I painted for a few years. I exhibited in group shows. I didn't have any individual shows. I was a very Chagallien kind of painter, I think, at that stage. And I became better known as a poet, and the poetry sort of took off, along with other bits of writing. And Clarissa and I decided to found this small press called a Star Wheel Press. In a small town where we lived then, not the one where I'm now, there were actually 4 private presses. It's because of technology. The old technology had died, and the small printing firms are all busily getting rid of their type and their printers and everything else. So we were all buying these things up. And having already worked with a couple of the other presses in the town, I thought, well, we could teach ourselves to set type, and we could make anthologies. I didn't contribute to the poetry in the anthologies. We invited 5 poets each time and 5 artists. I did contribute to as an artist, as did Clarissa. And each year we published a portfolio of signed new poems and new etchings. It was chiefly etchings we worked with. And that press, the Star Wheel Press, ran for, well, I don't know, ran for 9-10 years. Slowly Clarissa took over quite a lot of that work because I started translating, and translating is what slowly supplanted my visual art. I just didn't have time for it all that way. But yes, we produced some nice things, I think. They were chiefly bought by collectors of this, that, and the other. Sometimes you see them in second-hand book websites. They go for a great deal more than we actually asked for them at the time. But it was good. I mean, my first few books were full of paintings, of poems which were often to do with art, with visual art, either with paintings, and later with photographs, and later with films as well. And that has never completely gone away.
Thank you, George, for ending on this sort of lovely ekphrastic note. We'll pick up on this later, but can I now bring in another old, fabulous poet, old friend, who I met when she had just published her first book of poem called Fathom. And it's Jane Draycott is here. It's because of Jane Draycott. Jane said, you must meet Jenny. You'd really like her work. And it was Jane who had invited me to read at the Oxford University creative writing program, and they invite various authors to come and read. And one evening I was there to read. And of course, we spent the night there, I think. And so the next day I met Jenny. Since then, of course, we've known each other really well. I'm going to show some of her books because everybody from Britain, not everybody, but most of them tend to be at least outwardly very, very reticent, but they're not really if you get to know them. So this is a first book, Fathom, excellent. Then after that, this is relatively more recent. Mm-hmm. And this is fantastic. This is actually called After Gilgamesh, and it's a play. Mm. It's published by a small press called Malvern Press in Wales. Do support them. But I've had the privilege of actually seeing this play enacted at the Pegasus Theatre in Oxford. It was just brilliant. Babsi, right?
What?
Yasmin.
Yasmin, yeah, Yasmin Sidwa directed it for the Pegasus, for the Oxford Youth Theatre.
Yes.
She actually hired a pyrotechnician so they could play around with explosions, because it was sort of set between the Iraq War and ancient Gilgamesh, Sumeria. So, as you know.
So let me just formally read out her bio. I will paste the longer version on the chat box when she's reading. Jenny Lewis is a poet, playwright, and translator who teaches poetry at Oxford University. She has had 7 plays and poetry cycles performed at major UK theatres. Her first book of poetry, When I Became an Amazon, Iron Press, 1996, was dramatized and broadcast on BBC Woman's Hour, translated into Russian, and first performed as an opera by the Tchaikovsky Opera and Ballet Company in 2017. She published 3 further collections, including Gilgamesh Retold, Carcanet Classics Now, which was a New Statesman Book of the Year, a Carcanet Book of the Year, and an LRB Book of the Week on publication. And Carcanet's first ever audiobook. Fantastic. I didn't know they were doing audiobooks. Mm. Her translations of extracts from the work of the exiled Iraqi poet, also a common dear friend, who's on my screen, Adnan is just above in the mosaic, Jenny, but these mosaics can be all over the place. Adnan Al-Sai, another very, very fine poet. And when he reads in Iraqi, oh my God, the desert sands. But and I can understand a lot of Arabic, so I remember hearing you. So it's Khuda Hafiz. So she's just translated Adnan's new book, Let Me Tell You What I Saw, which I haven't actually seen yet. It's published by Seren this past October. Jenny, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sudeep and Indran, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful occasion and to follow George, which is such an honour. I actually bought your book, George, The Photographer at 16, right at the beginning of lockdown, and it was sort of a comfort, and it's a sad book, but also very funny in places. And it was a great comfort to have it. I've still got it on my shelf. And just before I begin, I'll just show you this. This is the Let Me Tell You What I Saw, my book with Adnan Al-Saig's poetry, which I've edited and translated with Ruba Abagaida and others. So it'd be lovely if perhaps Adnan could come on to one of your readings a bit later. I'll just start with this book, Taking Mesopotamia. It was about my father, who fought in the First World War. He was in the South Wales Borderers. He was wounded at Kut Al Amara in Iraq in 1917 and invalided back to India where all the British and Indian troops embarked for Iraq from. And he stayed in India for 18 months, which is something I'm very keen to follow up and go on following in his footsteps. As well as following my father's footsteps, I interviewed a lot of people for this book, soldiers, generals, people from the south of Iraq, the north of Iraq. And one of them was Adnan, and which is really how I got to know him very well. And we started collaborating in 2012, and we've been working together ever since. But the other one person was someone called Ramaz Ghazul, who grew up in Mosul, but had to flee a very long time ago, and has been living in exile in Britain since then. And I sent both Ramaz and Adnan long lists of questions, which they were kind enough to answer. And one of the questions was, what place do gardens have in your life? How do you tell me about gardens and how you relate to gardens? And so the first two poems I'm going to read are unrhymed sonnets for Ramaz Ghazul, and they're in the voice of Ramaz as a 7-year-old or a child, because these were the reminiscences that I wrote down and made these poems from. So the first one's called Cucumbers. In this Garden of Eden, where Genghis and Alexander left their marks and Cain murdered Abel, in this garden, this same garden, I tended my little patch of soil, growing melons with their showy yellow trumpets, and cucumbers, water holders, tubes of coolness shining in the desert. Before the flood, before the king list, known to Kurds, Arabs and Turkomans, Muslims, Christians, Jews and Chaldeans, Armenians, Yazidis, atheists, children of Mesopotamia, who might have run at first light to cut the best one, saying, as I did, Father, I've grown this for you. That was the first thing he grew in his garden, a very sort of misshaped cucumber, which he presented to his father first thing in the morning. And I think his father gave him a dinar to encourage him. And this was the second of a set of 3, but I'll just read 2. And this is called ul-Rabian. In Mosul, when the hottest hours made work and studying unbearable, we slept on thin blankets in the large hall, its porous marble surface sprayed with water, as outside in our copious garden, birds fled to the veined shade of pistachio trees to escape the sun that scorched the lawns we played on, made too hot to touch the taps that hung with icicles in winter. It mellowed only in the spring and autumn seasons, when my family picnicked in the fields outside our city, which is often called ul-Rabian, or Mother of Two Springs. And I'll next read a little from my last book with my latest book with Carcanet, which is Gilgamesh Retold. Gilgamesh is the oldest story in the world, I'm sure everyone knows. And Gilgamesh was an actual king who lived around 2700 BC in Sumeria in Mesopotamia, Iraq, and was a tyrant, met a friend, formed a great relationship, lost the friend. You know, it's sort of like the history of a man and also the history of the world, the epic. And many of the great epics like the Iliad, the Odyssey, Faust, Dante have grown out or have very strong roots in the Gilgamesh epic. So the first poem I wrote I've written it in 15 chapters in different poetic forms. And the reason I did that was because I teach poetry at Oxford, as do George and Jane. And I felt as I taught form, I should learn how I should make myself write it. And also I found reading a lot of epics. It's very, how do you choose the right form for an epic? I mean, blank verse is an obvious choice. And, if you think of George Chapman's Iliad, which was in iambic heptameters with using a lot of enjambment, very close to blank verse, because he was a dramatist. He knew Shakespeare, and he wrote for Philip Henslowe. And so you get the tremendous drama, and I think it's a much, much more exciting version than Alexander Pope, but I'm sure people might want to argue that at the end. But anyway, I best not use up all my time with talking. So I'll just read you chapter 12, when Enkidu, the friend who Gilgamesh loves, either as a brother or a lover, people have their own interpretations, has died, and he, as well as grieving for Gilgamesh, he's terrified of dying. Rilke said, "This is the epic of the fear of death." So he goes, he wanders in the wilderness, and then he travels to the edge of the world, where he meets this mysterious goddess called Siduri, who runs a tavern at the edge of the world, which in itself is a very exciting and mysterious thing. And something that's mentioned is Emmersal, which is women's language, which existed, it was referred to in Sumerian Akkadian work poetry. No one really knows what women's language is. It can be a soft way of speaking, it can be a falsetto, all sorts of different interpretations. No doubt someone will crack the code and find out eventually. So he reaches the edge of the world. Shrouded in hoods and veils, she lived alone at the sea's edge beside the salty spray, and she was tough as wind-blown marram grass, whose roots creep craftily beneath the dunes and bind themselves to knot the flying sand. Her dishes, racks and cups were solid gold. Her wine and beer was casked and kept in gold, her tavern only visited by gods. She saw him coming from a long way off, at first a speck, a spot, a moving dot, but closer up she saw he was a man, so trouble-scarred, a leather sheath of bones, his face a pitted shield of dents and hacks that life had dealt him or the stony world. As he drew near, she ran to bolt her gate, with shackled breath, her chest a tightened strap of terror as she climbed up on her roof. "You woman, open up!" his shout was rough. She gave back words to him in Emmersal. "First tell me who you are, and why you're here, and why you batter rudely at my door." With this soft speech she tamed his seething wrath, and spoke to him as she would any king. "The path you've come is far, yet it must stop as every other's must, except the gods, deep in the earth's loamed bed, where you will sleep and tread the dream road to the bitter end." At this, the listener's tears began to stream like hairs across a field in wintry sun. Siduri spoke once more and took his hand. "Your wife and children wait for you at home. Be wise, go back again to Uruk's fold. Among your kindred, you'll find warmth of heart is worth more than 1,000 precious rings. And love, not battle glory, is life's great gift." Have I had my 12 minutes? I've not. Shall I read a little bit more of the last? That was in blank verse, you probably pick that up. I'll just read a little bit of the 13th chapter, which is where Gilgamesh meets the flood survivor Utnapishtim, who is the equivalent of the Hebrew Noah that we all know so well. And in this poem, Enlil is the god of air who caused the flood. Ea is the god of fresh water who warns Utnapishtim to make a boat. And Aruru is the goddess of childbirth. And Sudeep, if I go over, which I know I shouldn't because it's very unprofessional, just do that and I'll stop, okay? So Gilgamesh reaches Utnapishtim and he begs him for the secret of everlasting life. And so Utnapishtim says, the gift of life was my reward, because when Enlil sent the mighty flood, Ea came to me one night to warn me first, to make a vessel huge of cedar wood, then gather seed of all that came from earth, each plant and bush, each tree, each bird that flies, each creature that is able to give birth, and bring them to the ark for sanctuary. I toiled to finish well before the storm, so when the tempest howled across the sky and people cried as they began to drown, the river rose to swallow all in sight, except my craft, which floated light as down. Even the gods and goddesses took fright and lay curled on the ground in sheeting rain, as dogs crouched by a wall in terror might, who, trembling, wait for rescue, but in vain. The sea became a city of the dead, and fishes made the forests their terrain. Each cedar branch with moonstone scales inlaid, each date palm grove a giant bed for whales, each mountain peak a rock beneath the waves. 6 days and nights the violent typhoon raged, then on the 7th, all was motionless. The warrior winds of Shamash had been caged. At dawn, a dazzling brightness met my eyes. I flung the window open and then gazed in awe upon a mirrored paradise. As the waters drained away, we found no humans left on earth except for us. We had escaped the fate Enlil had planned. So Aruru gave us this new status, a loan of humankind to be immortal. And how we long for this to be reversed, to be allowed to pass through that same portal that you so dread, my friend, that you so dread. Who wants eternal life when flesh is frail? Thank you very much.
Jenny, fantastic. Really, really fabulous.
Fantastic.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're involved with theatre and drama and your children's work.
That was Sarima, you probably guessed.
Yeah.
Very, very hard.
Quite difficult to read that Sarima, so I think it did it very well. It's quite beautifully disguised as well. I want to see it on the page.
That's what I would like to hear. Yes, I suppose the easiest is about which form carries narrative most fluidly, and I think, as I said, I think blank verse does. But I think it's interesting to use difficult forms because the tension of the meaning against the constraints of the form, I think, gives it an energy. I hope gives it an energy.
And well, I mean, form and rhyme and rhythm was sort of created because it was just the easiest tool to remember.
Yeah.
That's how poetry started. I mean, it's the origins of poetry. Yeah. Well, we'll come back to that. We'll pick up all these.
Okay. Lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Myself.
So
Thank you so much.
Now I will give it over to Indran, who will introduce Sara and Mervyn, and then we'll all come back at the end.
Thank you.
Indran,
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Sudeep. It's exciting to present two poets from this side of the Atlantic, two poets from the larger America. I want to mention a few things before I introduce Sara. You know, Sara is not only a poet and a very exciting, talented new poet in our language, American language, or English language, but she's also an editor and a collaborator and a confidant, and the evidence of her work as an editor is to be seen in the Beltway Poet Quarterly, which she edits with me, and we just released our new issue, so I invite you all to have a look. The issue is called The Dream Returned, and you know, we are in this business of bringing the dream back here and I hope everywhere. There are signs that the dream is returning, that dream that was deferred some time ago when Langston Hughes wrote this poem. And so my way of introducing Sara is not only as a poet, but as an editor, as a sifter through the language of our time, finding the poems that speak, that resonate. And really, I think about other collaborations in the history of literature, and I'm just very glad to have this chance to celebrate the work of an editor through when I talk about Sara Cahill Marron. Sara Cahill Marron is the author of Reasons for the Long Tomb. It was published in 2018 by Broadstone Books. Forthcoming this year, Nothing You Build Here Belongs Here from Kelsey Books, which I had the honor of writing a blurb. And Call Me Spez is coming out from Mad Hat Press in 2022, which is really a major work. We're all looking forward to seeing that as well. Her work has been published widely in all sorts of magazines and online and print. Small magazines, the salt and pepper of our work. Atlas Plus, Alice, Meniscus, Cordella, Newtown Literary, South Florida Poetry Journal, Golden Walkman, Lunch Ticket, and other anthologies. You can check out her work at saracahillmarron.com. And she's also a poet from the Beltway, lives in Washington, D.C. Let me welcome Sara Cahill Marron. Go ahead, Sara.
Thanks for that introduction. And in the interest of staying true to my adjectives, I'm going to read a sifted poem from a book that's next to me. Ties of our common kindred, disavow these usurpations, our connections, correspondence, they too have been deaf to the voices of justice, of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in necessity, hold them, hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. That's not a poem, that's from my copy of the Constitution that I keep next to me. I'm also a law student, so I wanted to read that as an introduction. It's just a section that I was paging through as I was listening to everybody else to introduce a poem that's actually going to come out in Punch, courtesy of Sudeep. And this is titled Power is of an Encroaching Nature. And that title comes from Federalist 48 by James Madison. And it's a warning. I'm sure many of you know that these conversations, the Federalist Papers between Madison and Hamilton, were to discuss the balance of powers in the United States. And this warning was about when if factions were to grow too large, what would happen? And so I took the words of these poems from FDR's inaugural address, and I was really interested in this particular speech because it was given in 1933. Let me just check my footnote here, 33, which was a tumultuous time right after the big crash. And we were recovering from the last pandemic that the world had seen. And I thought that it was a parallel time. So this is FDR turned to poetry. My fellow Americans, time to speak truth, endure, revive, assert. Fear is itself, less reasoning, but a terror paralyzing national life. Toil, foolish optimist, deny dark realities, momentary distress, plagues of locusts, indicted hearts of men, stripped self-seekers, no vision, no, visions perish. True, they've tried, yet callous confidence strives above honesty, honor, evil of old order, leadership attacking the common form, a constitution met every stress. I shall not evade clear course, crises, wars against great power given to me, in fact, a foe. Trust reposed in me, I return, I do less. Old values, old, young alike. Democracy, people have not failed. They mandate, they ask, they present. I take it, a nation of gods to come. And then I want to turn to, this is my first book. It's Reasons for the Long Tomb, Broadstone Books, published it in 2018. And these poems were written in 2014 and 2015 during the Ebola virus and the beginning of Trump's presidency. And I have a note here for myself that according to the morbidity report, there's 11,000 people that died in that pandemic. So I'm gonna read two of these. So this book is structured after the form of a rosary. So these poems are meant to be read sort of in a rhythm, one after the other. So I'll read number 7 and number 8 in a row. This is number 7. Riverside Drive Park, dark Hudson water, imagined as blue as the pen swirling, Ayn Rand to pixels, making maps, making sense, that you can read now, decipher. Hold hands, eyes darting 4 at a time. Backwards to check the crosswalk and catch the empty sculpture, the invisible man. Harlem's bronze body outlining trees, wet like lashes. Blinking back little star twinkles, mimetics from the George Washington Bridge. As specific as the day the lady died. Always remembering over lunch and coffee alone. If the worst we have to worry about is airborne calamity, sarin, or Ebola, then how to take the next inspiration of breath. Chemical thoroughfare is barely affordable, atrocious anomaly, yet bring them all here. Broken systems, beautiful ruins, gleaming with interferon and slick black suitcases swindled by the swifty suits, claiming to carry booze in black bags to put home in the fridge. Lock away the riches, don't be charitable. Competition sharpens, helps bolsters. How must you teach a starving man to fish? Some will die. 8. Tube tough and medical shoved down the throat in order to reach the breath that should be there already, inserting air in vacuous organs, empty vessels, empty bodies, blinking dead, empty machines are warm with electricity. The blip, blip, blot of life bubbles in an underwater white room. Nurses moving, rewind, 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 reversing, slow, in tandem movements, like the chest rising up and down with rising inflation, intubated down the esophagus, empty eyes. And I think, actually, I'm going to read one more from the book because I wanted to then read one from my chapbook that's related. Just thinking a lot about social media too this week. And the third chapter of this book is letters and poems that are built on the skeleton of different kinds of communications that we have, whether they're text messages, emails, or print. And this is a poem that's it's an obituary rewritten. And the poem that I'll read after this was written, is co-written with Indran in Facebook Messenger. So this one is, it reimagines what a suicide victim would have rewritten about their own death in the paper. And given what, the encroaching power, to return back to the first poem, of these corporations, I just think it's interesting to think about the text that we read in media. Okay, so this is number 9, chapter 3. Dear editor, the obituary for blank blank contained a multitude of inaccuracies that I would like corrected immediately. Understanding that the suicide was intentional and totally planned certainly bears relevance to a non-Christian empathetic reading of such a letter of mourning. Let this correction stand in print as a letter against the media that serves to deter the living from becoming distracted from the dead with the false realities that at their disposal, i.e. social media and the purveyance of public mourning through, quote, the wall. Continued reliving and reviewing of pictures and memories in a public forum while in the private sector, and the minimal human contact while feeling and being positively reinforced through the achievements and mythological absence of jongleurs to carry the harp of likes that they have gleaned the appropriate level of interaction, integral to normal social behavior. Death notices should stand as follows, including the postscript in which I have included a brief description of the prior day exactly 28 or 26 years ago, in which to frame the referential death accordingly. This shall help the viewer immensely in experiencing the death scene, which, because the physicality has already occurred, is very much over. Crematorium memorial services are largely for speeches and flowers and exist in the absence of a subject. Death is not a very absent matter. If you've experienced it, you'd know. November 15th, 2014. Trapped in an obituary, the headline tells of Orangevale's darkest night, rehearsing cyberspace soliloquies for the king, deceived by silence, the woman who was a man winning land for abandonment of gender. Queer theories of medieval space, a realm of sardonic time and place held and stitched by tradition and sedition, and poor, poor peasants praying for death before sickness. Citrus Heights, California has many funerals. Young people in tattoos gathered today to listen to eulogies about a friend who now has his name carved in stone. Etchings on the wall pixelate, scroll, vanish, appear, bombard, confound, and are lost in the web like dust in the wind. November 15th, 1985. Announcements. Crowd jostle, jolt, push, jockey for space in the stifling room. The shortest stories ever written are crammed into the local section in the Fontana, California paper. All art is connected to money. When I think about culture, I get out my checkbook. A flower opened when no one was watching, and the balloons were slowly letting out their helium. All the water in Folsom Prison runs past Folsom River. From the fish hatchery and non-English hide along those trails, there was not one tattoo on the woman in the hospital giving birth. She was covered in sweat and exhausted. The doctor comforted her and praised her for a job well done. Her husband smoked a cigarette in the lobby. There birthed a boy. Trapped in the letter, within that little dash, is the rest. This is from Reasons for the Long Tomb. It's available on my website. This next poem is from the chapbook that Indran mentioned. It's called Nothing You Build Here Belongs Here, and the poem is called Waiting for Faith. The first 2 stanzas were written in conjunction with Indran via Facebook Messenger, and I finished the poem on my own, but it was a poem in conversation via this social media platform. Waiting for faith. The train will come. I have faith in the train. The metropolis practice religion. The hoi polloi practice God. The trains run on timetables. Thank you for giving me hope. Well prayed. I am meditating on the red line, flashing lights of the hobbled train. My heart open like the gaping tunnel, kin with transport, ports of vessels, blood-like bat flights, pearls of sweat dripping down my back, purgatory platform waiting, waiting. Unholy headache, unholy wristwatch, cracked, time wrong, slipping slow, holy time, so slow slides around human aches, standing still. We are packed, filled, salted, smogged, all breathing underground stench. Hopeful as a new Christ. A metalwork Messiah gliding over electricity and steamy heaps of crumpled food paper, newspapers, soil waste, backwater, dead things, rat shit, pack traps, flick, the third rail humming a buzz, that we are clean, cleaner than clean, and sheathed in smooth cabins, rising from darkness, we emerge. New train, now on another track. New train coming. How am I on time? Can I read one more, Indran?
Yes, please go ahead. Please, Tony.
Okay, wonderful. I'm gonna read, I guess a happier, this is it's a love poem, I guess. They're called Duties of a Lover. It's from a series. This is number 10, and these are all written, whatever we're calling this time period, pandemic, during the pandemic. Duties of a Lover 10. This will also be out in Punch, so check out the wonderful Punch magazine. Duties of a Lover 10. The satisfaction of pulling down your mask, your face into mine. Quickly washing when you go, I wait to be alone. Time when sun streams, writing freely. A duty to myself, to celebrate myself. Sending emails from my nest only for bird eggs and hatchlings who happen to survive the spring fall. Ground scavengers mad for worms, insects, seeds. I've moved on, ready for the next season, myself. Glassed irises reflect every twilight. Dropping feathers for strangers to muse on, carrying generations in my wing beats. For centuries, I've built hangars and mountain passes, overlooks higher than human lungs sustain. Legs give up far below. Craggy terrain, defiant to scrupulous steps. Waterless bodies, these mountains. Tear up shoes, crack frail bones. Little boys build campsites, warm flames, sedentary things, myself. Careful to send cooling clouds, rain showers, pull green tendrils from the earth for meals, lick a little stardust, dance in a wide circle, grow up as basil beneath your feet, myself, a hand you never held, scented, you fail to take me with you. Tremors quake, little fires lit quick, gulp the last of the coffee, incense burned in the bathroom, door slams on the way out, baby bird, what song? Myself, exhale you in the smoke.
Bravo. Bravo, Sarah. Wonderful.
Beautiful, beautiful, Sarah.
You finished strong. Stronger, stronger. You know, as we say in America, you killed it. Well done, well done. You know, thank you.
Indran,
Thank you.
may I just insert a line before you say something?
Yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, Sarah, one of the things I was struck by, because you sent me these poems for Punch magazine, and you sent 2 sets of poems. One was typographically challenging. And because Punch magazine is online, I know the editor and the designer have a hard time setting poems up. So even though I wanted some of those poems from the more challenging, typographically risky sort of, I thought it's safer to take the more left-aligned poems because I know that they're not going to be. But it's very important to see her poems on the page as well. So I just thought it was important to say that. And when you read it, I could see some of those lines, the way you were connecting, because I have it open on the another screen on the side. Really well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you again, Sarah. And you know, we'll go to the next poet, last poet for the day, but we'll have time to talk afterwards. And you know, the first and the middle. I mean, Mervyn Taylor is a consummate poet's poet. You know, he's been a great friend for many years. We first met in New York in the late 80s when he read in the Word of Mouth series at the Chatham Square branch, the Chinatown branch of the New York Public Library, and that goes back 30 years, more than 30 years, and he is just a brilliant poet. I always think of him as a kind of Chekhov in poetry, you know, a master of miniatures, a master storyteller. He's from Trinidad, and he goes back and forth between Trinidad and New York. But in this last year, he has been in Trinidad, in his father's house, which is very interesting. And I'll let him talk about that if he wishes. But in this pandemic, he's back home. He has taught Bronx Community College, the New School, and in the New York City public school system. And he's authored 7 books of poetry. He's written a lot more than that, and new books are in the works. These books include, every one of them, a classic, Waving Gallery, and most recently, The Country of Warm Snow, which is a recommendation of the Poetry Book Society. His work has been written about by many eminent poets, including Derek Walcott, who was a teacher of his at Columbia, along with Joseph Brodsky. I mean, he, very lucky poet, Mervyn worked with these poets. Walcott wrote once publicly, Taylor's quiet voice. His poems possess an admirable degree of subtlety and a tone that keeps him separate and unique. He's getting a lot of attention these days, not only in Trinidad, where he's written about in the newspapers, and he's recognized on the street corners. He's always recognized in the street corners of my heart and my mind. Welcome, Mervyn. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Indran, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks, Sudeep, and my appreciation to all the poets who are here today. It was wonderful. I thought I might start off with the new poem, which is sort of a common practice of mine, and writing something that I usually don't do, a prose poem. I think there's a contradiction between prose and poetry, so I don't know how prose poem came to be, but I find myself trying these new steps, simply called Gum. In American movies, especially war flicks, chewing gum was a sign of staying calm while bullets whizzed overhead, of the kindness of GIs as they passed out sticks of it to wide-eyed kids. In Minnesota this past summer, while a policeman kneeled on George Floyd's neck, one of the officers kept chewing as Floyd called to his deceased mother that he was dying. And recently, after they broke down her door, police handcuffed a naked woman who kept repeating, "Wrong house, you've got the wrong house." One of them chewing as she stood, tears running down her cheeks into the creases of her skin. And when the sergeant put his jacket over her shoulders, it didn't cover her properly. They could still see how dark she was. She'll always remember their faces, especially the one who never stopped chewing, who never once looked away.
Oh, brilliant.
The Expatriate Teacher. I'll take you kind of going back. This is a book called No Back Door, which is from 2010, I believe. The Expatriate Teacher. It's funny, these poems come to haunt you after a while because you find yourself doing exactly what they predicted you would. The Expatriate Teacher. He invents new reasons for going home, to hang new curtains, to pick ticks off the dog, to describe the mountains and stop and start again as if he had gotten an adjective wrong, to chastise the government, to see for himself how things had gotten out of hand, to survey the savannah until the ocean, how much it has come inland, to see his sisters, how slowly now they enter a room, how much more they say he looks like his father, to close a window he thinks he left open, the rainy season about to begin, to see if the 2 o'clock sun had really gotten hotter, or if it was just his blood beginning to thin, to see if he could take the fatigue without flinching. Again and again he goes back to find a bench where he could sit quietly without moving, to hear the children say, "Sir," and help them punctuate the rest of their sentences. The same fellow, man in the back. There is a man who lives in the house in the back. He is there by himself with his thoughts and words he writes to express them. A little dog has befriended him. It sleeps behind the sofa, waiting for him to come out of his trance. They go round the savannah together, people complimenting the dog, telling the man to shorten the chain when it becomes too difficult to control the animal. Back in the house, the man is grateful for the chance to have been seen doing an ordinary task. For all his work with words, a simple thing like naming the dog eludes him. Dog, he calls him. Dog. So those are from the book No Back Door. And the next one I'll do is from the same book, a poem titled Stutter Step. I think I do better without these. Stutter Step. Old men don't stagger because they're drunk. Their legs just don't go where they want them to. They look distracted because they're thinking about some things they might have done differently. Old men are fools for wondering how they got here when they started out for somewhere else, even had a map. They retrace their steps and stand at the crossroads looking this way and that. They almost get run over, not by young punks, but by other old men whose shirts are buttoned the wrong way, who slap away the wife's hand, insisting they can do it themselves. They call a friend, and when he no longer answers, they cradle the phone quietly, emitting one of those long sighs that only a lover from the very distant past can hear. She who died in the back of a taxi cab, or suddenly on a cruise, somewhere out in the middle of the Atlantic when their song was playing. Old men do the stutter step, a kind of dance that comes naturally to them, hesitation, while the feet try to figure the next move. So, and then there's colonized. The country of Haiti comes to mind so often during these troubled times, you know, as a people who resisted everything that is wrong with the world today and are still paying the price for it. Colonized for Haiti. What do we owe them for taking back what was ours? Nothing, except perhaps a swift kick in the backside as they go out the door. What should we keep? A mimicry of their waltzes, a sullen face whenever the word slavery comes up, and then a quick wash in the river, a good scrub with the stones. This habit of borrowing from Peter to pay Paul has left us empty-handed, like the lady looking for food who grew tired walking and lay down to die, like the tailor making a long shirt to cover his behind. What should he do when they ask for money, but tell them he doesn't have material for pants, never mind pockets, and only decency keeps him from raising his arms? Maybe we should sail our leaky boats and bring back great-great-grandfather and show them his skin, where it is signed with the whip's calligraphy, paid in full. So, I will do a poem from the Waving Gallery titled Sedona. What page is that? Page 44. Sedona. For Kimberly. By now, the desert air should have calmed your fears. Mine are still rock hard, if nothing else, good for building fences. In Arizona, if I recall correctly, standing close to the saguaro creates a sense of euphoria. Have you done that yet? When you lived at the Y on Lexington, in that cupboard of a room, you'd cut the neck off a Pepsi bottle so I could pee. I imagine where you are now. I could stand at your back door and spray the stars and send the peccaries scooting back into the hills. I picture your father, old army man in his trailer with his collection of bottle caps. What he would do if he ever saw my behind with your legs wrapped around me, what he would fasten the door with so I couldn't leave. And your mother closing up her gas station in Baltimore to spend Thanksgiving with your brother in Virginia, discussing your topless cleaning job, chastising his wife for being overweight next to her gelding son. I would come visit you where you are now, far from the family, close to the meditative quiet you seek, undoing whatever harmful side effects years of medication have produced. But never having gone to Pittsburgh where you sought respite in the cold and gurgled as you walked, so much water did you drink. I doubt I'll ever make it out to Sedona, out there among the spas and communes, the retreats, the mountain mantras, to take a deep breath and hold. Again, deep breath and hold. My road takes me in an opposite direction, towards my folk and their silences, where the water laps these shores. Sedona. Okay. So I will do a poem for, this is a poem for Amadou Diallo's mother. When the policeman who shot his son was set free. It's called A Well-Bred Woman. She leaps to her feet, condemning the cops who shot her son. She turns into something primitive, screaming the American word for a man who sleeps with his mother. She puts her hand over her mouth as she hears the keys rattle, as they are let out to walk free on the grass outside the courthouse where no lion waits to eat them, though she prayed for one. No owl hooting at the noonday sun, no calamity like a building waiting to fall on the black sedan that drives away with them down the highway. The reporters ask, and she tells them, Amadou is a common name in my country. It is like stones on the road. And there are many fathers named Diallo who all rush out when they hear the drums saying, your son, your son, your son Amadou. They look everywhere, in the home, in the compound, in the cassava fields down by the riverbank, where the crocodiles steal the goats. They search until they remember the one who went to America. And then they hug the remaining Amadous and weep. So, how am I doing for time, Sudeep? Am I okay?
You're doing well, Mervyn. Mervyn, we can't say
Okay.
no more. You have to call.
One more.
You got to call your own shot, sir.
All right. I will do a poem. This is a poem called Remember. And I actually wrote it as a farewell speech to my high school students, a graduation address. And well, I guess it was a poem to begin with. It's called Remember for my students at EBT in Williamsburg. If we meet again after this on some street corner or in a marketplace in some foreign country, when the bombs have stopped dropping and you balance a beautiful baby in one hand and young melons with the other, if we stand there in the hubbub, each staring and saying how much the other has changed or looks the same, if I don't remember your name as I introduce you to someone who has befriended me and stands patiently while we recall days when the world had gone crazy and you asked me who would save it, remember I said, you will. Even if I leave, even if you never hear from me again, you'll find someone to tell your story, who will get word to the front that the war is over and the children can go back to the classroom now, who will find me wherever I am, in the mountains, by the sea, waiting and listening for the quiet that will let us think. And when we walk away from each other, you by way of the oranges, me by the fish, my friend will look back and I'll remember your name. So just maybe one more from my new book, which it would be terrible if I didn't mention. This is the new book. It's called Country of Warm Snow from Shearsman Press in England. And I'll read one in here. Okay. Nation Talk. It's a poem written for Kamau Brathwaite, who passed away recently. And there's a line from him. You just thank God that your bubby is still big. Kamau Brathwaite, by the way, is the famous, yes, Barbadian poet. You mentioned bubbies, but no woman could say you insulted them or made them shame, unless they were already ashamed of themselves, of their mother and father. No one could say you made them feel abandoned, that you saw them crying and passed them straight, or didn't take bread from your mouth and give them. When you sang Limbo, we knew full well it was both dance and prayer you meant, the face passing an inch below the fiery bar, legs trembling as we came back up. And when you saw those heads bob like coconuts in the Caribbean Sea, separated from bodies, we knew not to run, but to wait till the tide brought them back to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mervyn. Thank you. Amazing. I mean, I don't think there are adjectives enough to celebrate this reading. All of the four poets. Thank you so very much. Really, I'll ask you yes, let's have a chat for a few minutes. I know we're running late, but I think we should just give ourselves that. So, Sudeep, do you want to ask the first
Yes.
question?
First, I just want to respond. I mean, I was feeling that I'm back in the Caribbean Sea, being towed. The undertow was just electric, And you have actually, while you're reading, we have four great writers from the Caribbean who are live here. John Lee, you're here. You should put your video on. Barbara Jenkins is here.
Mhm.
Travis Weeks is here, I can see. So these are, I would say that pillars, no. But
Hi, Barbara.
tell her, Ted, Indran introduced us. You were a student of Brodsky and Walcott. How was that? I mean, it's such a privilege.
It was wonderful. And besides their teaching, it was wonderful to see their reaction to each other. One thing that stays in my mind is I think Brodsky had some heart issues and so on, so that each time he would light up, which was pretty often, almost every day, Walcott would walk by and grab the cigarette out of his mouth, So that just to see these two great poets interact on a friendly basis was incredible. Walcott actually brought Brodsky to Trinidad and had him read here. Yeah, something, and very demanding, both of them. Poetry, not just their mistress, poetry was their god, and anything. Somebody said once that Walcott said when he was in his room writing, the only two things to disturb him for, that is, if the house was on fire or if his mother had died. Otherwise, don't interfere. Yes, and Brodsky, of course, was great. Yeah.
If I may, there was
the only one who can carry that message would be Sigrid. Nobody else would be.
Yes.
No, I've had the privilege of learning under them.
Right.
It's just incredibly so. I mean, you're fearful when they're reading your poems because they're just so strict. And then you flip over on the other side. If they like your poetry, my God, they're like warm brothers. Yeah.
A great moment for me was in the first semester with Derek, and I had a short poem called "On Sundays Like This" was the poem, and I thought he hadn't paid any attention to it, and we were all of us, Walcott and students, and on the way going to the restaurant, he said, "Recite that poem again," which was incredible. But there was a particular line in it when they say, men are not always hungry, sometimes on Sunday. And Walcott had this big guffaw of a laugh, if you remember him, where he would just throw it out, and to be asked to repeat a line, I mean, I remember it, so it must have been wonderful. Yeah.
Very good. Walcott used to say, as you always reminded me, "Donde está musica?" Where is the music? And
which is one of the poems.
Maybe you can talk about that. Yeah.
Which is one of the poems in the new book, right? "Donde está?" Yeah, that was his line. Brodsky's famous comeback is if you didn't get things right or if you went on for too long, was "nonsense," which was fine too, Yes.
And he would go, of course, he smoked so much, he's like, meow. Remember, meow. At one level, you see these two great people acting like children, which was, I mean, of course, I think people should read this particular book. It was published by Faber. It was written by 3 essays by Seamus Heaney, Brodsky, and Walcott, a homage to Robert Frost. Beautiful, beautiful essay. It was published as a book. Of course, they were great friends too. They all would meet up in St.
All
Lucia.
of them, yes.
All of them, yes.
Mm-hmm.
What a time! What a time! Please feel free. Others can ask questions as well. Comment.
Hello, John.
John, what do you have for us?
Hi, how are you guys doing? I'm enjoying the
Good,
session.
good.
Sudeep, very nice. Hi, Mervyn. Jenny, good to hear you. Sarah,
Hey,
good
how
to
are
hear you
you?
all. New poets to me, but I like what I
Yeah,
heard. And I've certainly got to
thank
be
you.
reading more of Mervyn's poetry recently. So
Thank you.
it's great. It's good. It's good. But
Where,
great,
where
Sudeep,
are
to
you,
doing this
John?
with Indran. Oh, I'm at home in St. Lucia.
Where are you joining? St.
I'm
Lucia?
in,
Okay, great.
I'm in St. Lucia, and it's raining behind me now. So rain is coming down. So you have all the atmosphere of here, you know? So good to see you all. Good to hear all the good poetry.
Yeah, John, we'll have you on the
Thank you.
show.
Wonderful. I
Yes,
look
Jenny
forward to that.
too, Jane, well, and lots of you. I'll write to you guys separately. Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Good.
Sudeep and Indran, can I just say that you've created this wonderful, it really is like being in a room all together. I don't know what magic you use to do it, but
It's
these
very simple. We didn't create the magic. It's
are really wonderful, and I sent details to some of our students last time, and they were completely blown away, and they said this is how poetry reading should be. There's something magic about it. I think
Thank
it's the allowing dialogue and encouraging people to, because it's quite daunting, isn't it, to actually say anything on Zoom when you're one of a big sort of crowd of people. But I think you've done something very special indeed, actually. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's actually, I think Indran and I started this in my apartment in New York 30 years
I
ago.
was just going to say
Yes,
that.
I know, yeah. Mm.
It was an in-person thing, and
Yeah.
we would organize this in my flat. And of course, I was a student then, so I had hardly any money. So I had only one chair and one table in the room. So I would roll out the whatever durries and cushions. So people sat on the floor in the Indian Batak style, just Upper West Side, New York. And we would pass around a hat and collect whatever donation we would get, and minus the 2 cheap boxes of wine, red and white, which went very, very quickly. And then to the readers as a fee. And it was a hit. It was a fantastic hit. And it's just, the other day we were just talking, and I said, we should just revive it online. And people are so hungry. So I suspect we carry that same energy. And we are not, we are not Western as such. So, he's from Sri Lanka, I'm from India. So we bring that madness of tactility, I suspect.
But one thing about that original series was the living room was rather large, so we had a good space, to sit around in. So the rents must have been cheaper then. Anyway, we managed, and now we're here, and we'll be doing this once a month. And really delighted that you today, George and Jenny and Sarah and Mervyn. Are there any questions that you have for about? I have a question for all of you, and it's about the role of the poet. I know it's a sort of perhaps you'll be a little cynical about this question, but just to say, wrote that poetry makes nothing happen. But here we are in a time when so much is happening, and I feel that we should engage with what is happening in our poems and in our sharing. So I would just, if any of you would like to reflect on that, on whether Auden can be updated or modified in the guts of our living poets today, to use another one of his lines. Go ahead, anyone who would like to take that one.
I have something to say about this.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I think it's about propaganda. It's about moving people. Poetry moves people. But the trick is to get what you write in front of people that need to be moved. If you publish your poems in the New Yorker, I don't know. I mean, some people need to be moved, I suppose. But if you publish your poem in a local paper, it's a whole different deal. Or in an academic journal even. So I look for places that are different, that where it's not just poets who are going to be reading me, but other people also. And I think that's important. Even if it's not a poem, a letter to the editor, but move people with it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. Because otherwise the pool of people gets quite small and inward looking, doesn't it? If it's just the poetry journals, you know.
I remember that, you know, Dana Goya, in a famous essay, Can Poetry Matter, which became the title essay of a larger book, made a very similar point to what Don is saying. And he pointed out how many of the writers, the 40s and 50s, whether Eliot or others, did a lot of writing in newspapers about poetry, and in a sense popularized poetry. But since that time, you have the creative writing department, of which many of us possibly are part, and poetry sort of came away from the public square into a kind of closed off place. I think, for example, if I use Sudeep as an example, Sudeep has published, many of us here, our poetry, George and so on, in Punch in India. So our poetry is going into quote unquote popular type newspaper magazines where people can read poets from all over the world. And I think that's what we need to get back to, rather than the closed academic, you know, creative writing circles. But Dana Goya's essay, most of you probably know it, really is worth a rereading in terms of his point about using the popular press, as it were, like newspapers and newspaper columns for reviews and commenting on poetry. So I thought that was a good point Don made. I think it's something we need to try to get back to. And what we're doing here this afternoon now for us, is part of that effort, I think. And I think it's really worth pursuing and pushing that more. A lot of the stuff we've heard today needs to be heard by more quote unquote ordinary people, people who just want to hear the sound of poetry and the sound of our comments through poetry on events. And final word, to hear a Gilgamesh again, to hear the Ark story again, which is so, you know, it never loses their power. It's a point to share.
Yeah, no, John, you're absolutely right. And I think that also the important thing is because this is really cutting across so many time zones. And the problem is some of my friends in Australia, they were complaining. I said, you know, we can't please everybody. Half of you will be sleeping. You know, it's penumbra and umbra. I mean, right now it's 11:15 at night in Delhi. And, you know, it doesn't even matter when there's good poetry and good conversation around. So that's the important thing. And that's the connecting it is important. And also the breaking of the boundaries, which is very, very important, because poetry, there's a pleasure of high culture. There's also pleasure in that. Low culture, there's pleasure in that. But, you know, if you move the hierarchies and just concentrate on the language itself and what moves the head and the heart, if they can be connected properly through language, I think that's the trick. And that's what's happening here. That's, you know, there's a compassion here, there's camaraderie here, there's all the things that poetry should be doing, really, is here. And thank you, you guys are doing it. And just the accents is wonderful. I mean, you know, suddenly Mervyn is speaking in a way that you have to sort of retune your register, or John is speaking in a particular way, or Indran speaks in another way, and then of course George and Jenny speak, you know, in the clipped English way. Though, yeah, it's just fantastic, and it's just, you know, there'll be so many good people coming through. And talking about Punch magazine, you know, Punch magazine is a kind of it publishes fashion and it publishes all sorts of things, but the editor has been very kind. You know, she's given me, I curate the international fiction and poetry for them. And he says, you know, if you don't interfere, then I'm going to just bring in stuff which I think people ought to read. It has got nothing to do with commerce or high art or low art. It's just about language, because ultimately that's what politics is based on, what love is based on, and so forth. So many of you have been in Punch, many of you. So please spread the word around. And also, I think Indran and I will be very open to privately hearing from you, who, you know, your suggestions of who else can be reading on this. And just think of quality, forget French, just quality. And not just quality, also where we can talk about the poetry. I think there's not enough engagement about poetry in terms of conversation in these online platforms, I find. So this is something that we would like to do.
Yeah, I just wrote my email, indranmx@gmail.com in the chat if anyone needs it. And
Yes.
you know, I see ways to storm the citadel, and one way is with poetry. It doesn't hurt, it doesn't.
Indran, your audio is.
Your audio is funny, Indran.
Oh, sorry. Did you hear a joke in a way, but perhaps a bad joke about?
No,
Hear me?
lost you.
Yeah, Indran, your audio is.
There are many ways. Oh, okay. Well, me now.
It comes and goes.
Well, sorry. I think my audio is. Well, I'll stop there. I was just making a reference to storming the citadel. You know, there are many different ways to do that.
Since he's Indran,
Yeah.
can I pick up on, since you're breaking up a little there, just as an editor, you know, magazines are one thing and publications are one thing, but as a, you know, standing at the apex of two disciplines, poetry and law, I was invited to read with you on the Zoomathon when we did the fundraiser for the Democratic Party, and I read a poem that I had written. I've been doing a lot of these echo poems to, you know, revisit Yeats, Whitman, and then Tennyson. I read a Tennyson echo poem in front of the Capitol back in late October, right before the election. And inserting, I note someone had said in the chat that they leave their poetry on buses, but being the prism of poetry in places where you are, where you live, I think, at least for me, in my own practice, is important, other than just publishing and you know, having books out and selling books or something. Being the poet in my life is how I'm thinking of using poetry, you know, and then like reading documents like this. And I remember as a young poet, I was really moved by Norbese Phillips' book Zong, where she takes this legal text and turns it into poetry. So that's one way I'm thinking of poetry now.
Yeah, it's important to have the body of the poet along with the poetry. Sometimes really gives a strong lesson. I think always of someone like Muriel Rukeyser, who was always present with her verse. I mean, and the story goes, and it's true, that she went to Australia when there was a young poet in prison there, and she read for almost a year daily outside the prison walls until finally the prisoner was set free. Now, I'm not sure if it was because of her reading. I knew in some part it had to do with that. I made a funny joke with Indran, and I don't know, I don't think he took me seriously, but I told him while these people were storming the citadel these past few days down at the Capitol, I told him he needed to take up those recent poems of his and get down on the streets there and read. But I'm glad he didn't, because looking at the results of these things now. But you know what I mean, that there's a need for loudspeakers and for us to drive around like they used to advertise movies in the old days with loudspeakers on top of trucks and read poems from loudspeakers on top of trucks. You know, and not to wait until the riot is happening, but to do it on some peaceful Sunday evening, right around with speakers on your trucks, and give them what they need, give the people what they want, as they say.
Right.
They don't know they need it yet, but they will. Yeah.
Sara's
Good idea.
Sara's comment about, you know, writing poems with other poets reminds me, this is such no, I mean, she said that Indran and Sara wrote this poem on Facebook Messenger. I mean, back in the old days, I don't know, I'm sort of not that old, but I did a whole book with a friend of mine. It was exchange. I mailed the poem, literally snail mailed the poem. It would go, you open the envelope, the stamp was from another country, then you take the poem, you respond to it, and then you sort of write back. The epistolary technique, in a sense, goes back to the foundations of the really Pamela and Shamala and so on. And now you have this sort of super fast electronic thing. So with another friend, I was doing this, and then of course we moved to email, and then it was Twitter, and I felt it was really affecting the form because I was writing longer poems. But text, it just reduces, so it was an odd sort of feeling, and I said, it doesn't matter. Then in any case, one is so analog oriented, at least when it comes to poetry for me, that I have to print it out to feel that it's a poem, and on the screen it doesn't feel the same. I wonder what others are. Jane, what do you think? You teach poetry at Oxford. I mean, how do people respond to such things, technology and literature and writing itself?
First, before I say anything else, I have to say thank you so much to everybody for this unbelievable. It's been a dark afternoon and it's turned into a bright evening here. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, well, the students we're teaching, a lot of them, not all of them, are, it's a new generation coming up. It's very interesting to hear what you say about form. So, form and platform, if you want to think of it like that. I think that's but of course, George has been writing fabulous Twitter poems for a very long time. And that's been a very exciting, a kind of small, like starburst energy each time. So yeah, I think that zone where you think about form and platform is obviously new. And I think it's very exciting. And I think it's what a lot of our younger students think about a lot of the time. It's what's in play for them a lot of the time.
Mm. Sorry. Sudeep, okay, go ahead, Jenny.
Okay, I just wanted to say I really love Sarah's idea of taking a legal document and somehow finding poetry in it. What a great way to get to reach a wide audience and to break down the sort of mystiques and the hierarchies of language and behind these things. I thought that was great. And I also wanted to say, Sarah, that I thought as you're reading, it sounded like jazz to me. The rhythms were so important. You could almost have been singing it or just humming it and the words coming across the screen or something like that. But yes, I thought it was very fascinating. Yeah.
Especially the rosary, I think sort of worked really well. Yeah. Barbara, would you like to say something? Because Barbara?
John, when you get a chance, I'll jump in with something, Sudeep. When you get a moment, I'll jump in with something. I have to respond to something you said.
Jump in.
Okay, going now? Okay. In relation to what Sudeep said earlier, using different form, even writing poems with people. Another idea, again, coming from Dana Goya. He said, when you do poetry readings, if it's possible, you read one or two poems from one or two other poets. So say I'm doing a poetry reading, I would drop a poem from Mervyn or from Sudeep or from George or from somebody. And that helps also to strengthen and broaden the community and to bring other poets whom you like, start off with people you like, to the attention of other readers. And that way, the public square space, that kind of, we begin to open up the boundary. We can be so individualistic, so caught into our own little, how it goes already. But doing those little gestures can be so good. So you've just heard Jenny Lewis, you like her work. You say, hey, I just heard this poet, and before I read my poems, I want to read some excerpt from her. And I think that helps us strengthen the community and bring a greater awareness of what we're all doing to others. So it's something worth thinking about. I said that Dana Goya essay, which has just popped up this afternoon here, might be worth looking at again with those kinds of ideas, which connect with everything we're saying, actually.
And the other book, since you're talking about Dana Joya, the other book, which is really fascinating, especially, I mean, I don't teach at the university on a regular basis, but I keep going back to this book by Edward Hirsch, How to Write a Poem and Fall in Love with It. And he passionately sort of, talks about every poem as if it was a mistress or child. And sometimes, and he picks these sometimes very dense poems. And I've shown it to my partner, and she said, what's so fascinating about this poem? But when you read his commentary on the poem, it's not academic commentary, it's just what he thinks about the poetry in a very intelligent way. He makes it feel that it's so, so important to read that particular poem. So it's the sort of passion, really. But Barbara, come in. It's lovely to see you after 20 years.
It's been a long time. No,
Where are you? Are you in Trinidad?
I'm in Trinidad, yes. Yeah. And I don't consider myself stranded or bound by restrictions on travel or anything. I'm really enjoying the time to just appreciate where I am. And without feeling that I want to be somewhere else. It's wonderful. And I feel I'm many, many places today with this poetry. I feel that I'm met a whole community of people scattered all over in different time zones and the range of things that we have listened to today. But I want to take up a little bit on people reading poetry. There is a life that comes to the poem that lifts it from the page. I like the page too, because the page allows me into the poem. I'm not a poet myself, I've never tried poetry. But when I read a poem on the page, it is mine. And when I hear the poet read his poetry or someone else's poetry, it becomes not just the poet's, but it becomes everybody's. It goes beyond the confines of me into a community that is so much bigger. And I loved hearing everyone read their poetry today with their own music.
I could just say that I thoroughly approve of what John says about reading other people's work. It hardly ever happens. Mea culpa, me too. You say read for 20 minutes, you read for 20 minutes. But it is a great idea. I've heard that done only about twice. Have you heard it, John, quite often?
Yeah.
Yes. Now and then when in St. Lucia we do this, and someone's in the Caribbean, we do this. I think it should happen more often. I certainly try to do it myself and to share on poets, other people I like, And to mention people like Barbara, whom many of you may not know, she's a very good prose writer, novelist, has a good memoir coming out, I hear. But to just let other people know of who else is around, what other people are doing. But yes, you are right, George. It doesn't happen as much as it should. Perhaps from this meeting now, we can probably begin to, each one of us say, we're going to do this. Next time we read at least one poem from one person and let people know,
I think it's important to mention that Dylan Thomas used to, and in The Color of Saying, collection of poems of others that Dylan would read along with his own when he gave readings. And he was a superstar of poetry on the stage in his time, so it was long ago. And so I think there is, it has been done before and it can be done again, sharing of a generation's poetry through your own voice on the stage, and even a selection that you might edit, an anthology that you might publish. The channel I do on YouTube, the poetry channel, pretends to that by allowing a space for poets from all languages to present their poems, reading videos, one poem per video. So I invite you all to consider sending me videos of you to publish on that, in that space. I would really be thrilled and honored if you would consider that.
Give us an email so we can get to you. I have an email.
Yes, I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. Wonderful. Yes.
Thank you.
Can I say something apropos what Jane has said about form? Actually, I think there's so many ways of looking at this. I don't think any poet can afford to write without an awareness of form. But you can have form with lowercase f. You can have form with capital letter F. And you can have capital letter bold. or you could have a whole lot. There's a whole range of different things.
Mm.
I'm not personally against any of these things. Any of these things can be made to work. But form is just a kind of higher form of patterning and listening. And when you listen to poetry, you know, I think when I was listening to Jenny, of course, that's a very clear kind of blank verse, and it rings, it works. It works very well, I think. But I hear it in other people as well, because there are repetitions, there are cadences, and one listens to these things all the time. So, you know, it's not as though in talking about form, as though when we're talking about a very special particular kind of thing. That particular kind of thing, I think, can be very, very, very productive, as it has been for me at times. But I think it's our general concern. I mean, and not just in poetry, of course, but also, I think, in prose.
Also, I think also across the other arts. I mean, you know, I was talking about hierarchy. I mean, if you put classical music over pop music as something that is superior, that you're starting with a problem. Because each one in its own space is important in a way, and both use form and rhythm and cadence just as strictly as you would do otherwise. Also, listening to many of you, and you know, largely living in India, or at least this part of the world, and I think I'd like to bring Adnan in as well, because in many our traditions of poetry, we know poetry by heart. You see, so reading it aloud when we do readings, when we read other people's poems out, because it's in our head really. And the cadence and the accent is very different. Adnan, would you like to say something? Because, you know, that is the oratorical part, the throat, the guttural part in Arabic poetry is so important. You need to unmute yourself.
Still muted.
Adnan, you need to unmute yourself, please. There should be a button at the bottom of the screen, bottom left on the screen.
Right at the end.
Yes, thank you. Jenny, 168, if you like, please, in English.
Yes.
168.
That's how it starts with microphone disturbance.
Okay. هل كان هذا الفرات ودمنا المترقرق من عهد سومر حتى مصب الحكومات تكشط عن جلدنا الملح والانقلابات نأتي ونمضي كما موجة في فم البحر يسفرها لا نخلف فوق السواحل غير الزبد كل شيء بدد وما نحن إلا خيول سباق الأبد فلماذا ولدنا وفي عنقنا حبل مشنقة تؤرجحنا الريح ذات المنافي وذات البلد. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I was asking you a question, but your answer was even better than a prose answer, because you just actually read and sang your poetry, which was what we were looking for, really, in a sense, you know. No, it's just someone mentioned, it just struck me, and I mean, I make notes whenever I mean, these are possibly poems to the future. Someone said updating modern. I think it was Indran, right? Updating.
Yes.
It's almost like an oxymoron in a sense, but that's a good idea, because it's also been done by various people. Like, for instance, Louis MacNeice was so-called updated by Simon Armitage and Glenn Maxwell. They went to Iceland and tracked MacNeice's, I think, trekking route, and then rewrote many poems in a modern way. So,
if I may, this is a lovely, lovely afternoon and chat, but we're going into the beyond two
Your audio is gone, Indran.
down and thanking everyone. Hear me? Well, you can't hear me.
I think we got the idea though, Indran.
Hello.
Yeah, what
Yeah,
I'm going to keep
got
the
the
room
idea.
open if people want to continue to talk. I think there's no reason why we can't just continue as long as we wish. I thought I might stop the live feed and the recording if that's okay with you. And maybe,
Before you do that, let me just thank everybody.
yeah,
It's been a beautiful, beautiful evening. We have it for 1.5 hours, but it's usually 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So that's the format. And for a salon type reading, which is also strict and metered in a sense that everybody gets the right time, I don't know. This is a format which we are trying. So thank you for being patient. And Don, yes, you can formally close the room, but many of us actually just sit around and chat, and whoever wants to leave can do. But thank you so much. Thank you, George. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Mervyn. Next time you
thank
guys
you,
are here,
Sudeep.
pleasure. Come back as an audience and do recommend your friends and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Shukran, shukran.